As you might expect, digital retailing, not that new. In fact, the reality is we can call it digital retailing, we can call it whatever we want at Autos, but really it's e-commerce, right? We're talking about e-commerce, selling cars online, going through that process. Been around for a long time in a lot of different iterations. You've got folks like Carvana, Clutch in the Canadian market. You've got, of course, the Tesla folks doing their Tesla stuff. And the retailing environment, right, at dealerships, that's what we really want to talk about today, is how much of that experience can you make digital? What's the best experience for you? What's the best experience for your buyers? What's realistic in that whole space? So that's what we're going to get into. My name's Cruickshank. I'm the CEO and president of Leadbox. I'm stoked that you're joining me at my desk. Let's get into the details. All right, so let's check out the stats. Right here, we've got a whole bunch of surveys and some data that's come from the research that we've done getting into this, right? So we've got a survey from the Washington Post that said way back in 2017 that 53% of US consumers were extremely likely to buy their car online, entirely online. In 2019, funnily enough, 2 years later, only 7% of vehicle transactions took place entirely online. And in 2023, Cox Automotive did a great big study to figure out how many people preferred the idea and preferred to buy that vehicle online. And in fact, 21% of customers preferred that fully online experience. 71% actually preferred that hybrid experience, that multi-touch experience. Right? And that 71, that hybrid path is really what we're going to talk about today, because consumers have shown us very clearly that they do want to have that interaction in store. They do want to work with you, their local dealer. They do want to ensure that they have that experience where they can really go through this, frankly, complex transaction with a little help. So let's get into those details. So let's talk about what's most typical today, right? Where effectively 90% of the transaction is happening in store. It's very clear to everyone probably watching this episode and anyone that we work with that first 10% of the process, in fact, a lot of the process and decision making is happening online, right? Consumers are going through finding vehicles on your sites, going through all that process and making a lot of the decision before they even come into store. In fact, we find that consumers really know more about the vehicles than some of our sales reps, if not most of our sales reps, right? It gets pretty uncanny as far as the information that they have. So that dominant method for retailers today, it starts in that online environment. They go and check out all the details, and really that's where the online portion of the journey ends. From that point forward, the dealer, and we've talked about it in past conversations or at shows, the consumer is coming into the retail location to make their decision to transact. And that's the whole idea of really most people only go to one retail location and they transact on that vehicle and leave. The idea that folks go to 1.2 or 1.4, whatever it is, number of stores that they visit, it's really if that retail transaction falls apart. Right? So once someone's come into your location, you've got all of the ability to get them through the uprights and help them find that vehicle. So they're coming in, maybe they want to test drive, maybe they've driven the vehicle somewhere else, but they go through that test drive process. Negotiation happens in a face-to-face experience. You go through those details, or you might be a single price retail location, which takes that negotiation out of the way. Maybe you're just negotiating on a few details after that. The F&I experience, and that, when you go through that process, and many organizations will have that original process, sorting out the price of the vehicle and all that sort of stuff, and then you move to F&I and you go through the process there to go through and sign off on your financing. And it's an important thing to mention there is really, in my view, that's the primary reason why in-store purchasing is still so dominant, right? The financing process of that vehicle is so important to the consumer to get right, and there's such little confidence and knowledge relative to that consumer being able to go through that transaction on their own, right? There's not a lot of people out there, frankly, who can just go to a website, point and click, and buy that vehicle with the credit that they've got available or with the tools that they've got available without the help of a retailer, right? So for many other reasons, but that being a big one, transactions are going to continue to happen in store. You go through all that process, you get everything done, and then you arrange for pickup. And the dealer is going to get that vehicle all cleaned up, ready to go, and you're going to come in, pick it up the next day, and enjoy your new car. All right, so it's important to think from that sense. We've got 90% of the transaction happening in physical mode. So what are the benefits, right, for you as the retailer? Why would you want to go further down that transaction path online or have additional tools online to be able to help you? Well, in that more in-person piece, I think you're probably well aware of the main variables that are of particular value to you, right? So you've got stronger control or greater control over the process, right? And getting them through that transaction, right? You're able to sell them all the way through the experience. The next is relative to maximizing those F&I opportunities, right? When we talk about front-end gross and back-end gross, really improving that back-end gross is more likely to happen. And there's varying studies there, but we'll say, for this experience, you've got more control over that F&I process. So you've got great F&I team members. They get to go through and do the work of helping people make good decisions of what they're going to add on relative to that realm of products. Relationship building, right? We want consumers to have a long lifetime value with our retail location. We want them to have a great experience when they purchase the vehicle. We want to be able to introduce them maybe to the service manager or someone within the service team so that we can encourage them to come back to that location for service. If they need to get a roof rack at some point in time, maybe we want to introduce them to the parts manager. All those things that you can do to build that relationship with the consumer are harder to do online, right? So you can start to build that up. Better for trade-in assessments. I don't think anyone that I've spoken to recently is particularly excited about an online trade tool, mostly because of the huge variations and swings that we have in the cost of pre-owned vehicles today. It's very, very difficult to get a good trade assessment without physically viewing the vehicle. So that's super important. And less reliance on that technological infrastructure. Right? There's a lot of tools involved in making sure a transaction is going to go through the process online and that's going to run smoothly. So there's fewer technical hurdles that you're going to run into when you're working face to face. Even if systems are breaking down internally, right, we have tools and stopgaps to be able to get that deal done, to be able to complete that transaction. In fact, even recently in this past summer, we had to do that a whole lot more when some systems struggled. Right? It just is what it is. You got to be able to handle those hands-on. So with every pro, there's a con, right? So what are the downsides of this situation? Well, first off, you want to think about that limited reach and lead capture capability, right? When people are coming in online and poking all the buttons and doing all the things, it's a little tricky to get them to come into your store as opposed to when they're already physically there, right? The good old days of people coming down to the auto mall, walking through, making their decisions, you could really wrangle all of those deals in physical form. When someone is simply online browsing at midnight, whatever it is, it's a little trickier. They actually have to punch in their details, and that can sometimes be tough to solicit. Right? The sales cycle is another aspect of things that may be a little bit longer, the back and forth in those communications. Right? That can also lead to the next con, which is that labor-intensive aspect of things. Right? That longer sales cycle and figuring out those details, scheduling time, getting the dealer visit, getting the test drive, all those sorts of things. That's another layer each time. It also requires an additional team member to work through all those things. And just consider, it's not that long ago that we had the online experience or the online heavy experience of sales through COVID. In fact, so many organizations reduced their headcount because they had to do everything online, right? So the labor involved is a little tricky there as well. The walkaway risk, right? So consider that consumer that's coming in and going through that process without pre-qualifying or taking deposit that you could do online, the potential for them to walk away or break that deal may be higher, right? So being able to get a little bit more confirmation of that transaction prior to meeting with that customer could be of great benefit. Missed expectations is another aspect that can be a real con for today's buyer, particularly when you're thinking about buyers that expect a lot of convenience. Things like online features, tools that are going to help them with price transparency, or things that are going to help them book appointments to be able to come in and visit the retail location. So there's a number of features that are going to be important that we'll talk about more in that 50-50 option 2 of how you can do more online. And then the last one is that inflexibility for that busy buyer, right? We've got open hours. Sure, they're retail hours, the ability for people to come in and transact and do the things that they want to do. But the con may well be, trying to get a hold of that younger professional or that flex worker or that team member or not team member, but that customer who can't come in during those retail hours. Being able to open it wide open on the digital side of things really reduces that risk. So don't discount the fact that for the buyer, there's a lot of pros for that in-person activity as well, right? So when we're talking about coming in, buying that vehicle, a lot of folks really prefer that hands-on experience, being able to test drive, being able to see the vehicle, being able to get a real sense of all the features, the seating, the comfort, the drive of that unit. For many folks out there, that's an important piece of the puzzle. Personalized guidance, right? Getting help from a sales rep. There's probably 2 kinds of people in the world. Maybe there's 45, but whatever the case, some folks like working with a sales rep and going through that process and having the guidance, and some folks are just browsing, thanks, and they just want to go through that process on their own. But being able to guide that consumer through, help them with the details, many buyers are going to find that helpful, particularly for that first-time buyer who's unfamiliar with the purchase process, may be unfamiliar with financing as well. The next would be in-person negotiations. There's a lot of surveys out there relative to people preferring a fixed price or negotiated price option at a retail location. And there's a lot of differences in opinion in that respect, but many folks still prefer to negotiate that price, right? And it could be their background, it could be their experience, it could be things that they've done in past. They just feel more comfortable going through that process to feel like they got the best possible deal that they could, the best possible price for their trade. All right, so real important individual-based piece there. On trust and transparency, being able to feel that greater sense of connection with the retail location, with the people at the retail location, and be certain of trusting the experience. Oftentimes, that's far more successful in person. And then the last one, and also a really nice one, is that immediate gratification, right? Going online, going through the details, click, 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 and waiting a number of months for your vehicle or waiting a number of weeks for your vehicle delivery, all those sorts of things, that can be in certain cases a real problem, especially for someone who's recently had an accident and needs their vehicle and they got to get moving, whatever the case. But that instant gratification is a real nice piece of the puzzle for that in-store buyer. So then there's the con side for the buyer, right? The retail location isn't everybody's happy place, right? The reality of it is it can be time consuming, right? So it can be an environment that creates a need for multiple visits, wait times, going from person to person. The reality of that buying process when measured is it can be quite a few hours at the store to go through that process. I think all of us who are in the industry really like to accelerate that when it comes time for us to get a vehicle. And the reality is for most consumers is you need to block off a day, at least a full half day to be able to go through that transaction. So time can be an issue. Less convenience, right? So the busy lifestyle that we've talked about before, that consumer who's hard to reach in the time of day, working, makes kids, lives far from the dealership, all those kinds of pieces can be real important factors relative to that consumer trying to make that decision online or in person. The pressure environment. So when you talk about the salesperson, right? So often, we think about that salesperson as someone who is putting pressure on the buying decision. Some of the best salespeople out there are simply there to answer questions, solve problems, help provide guidance. But there are folks out there that are providing that pressure, or just consumers that feel that sense of pressure and can get overwhelmed by that experience. There is another perspective also of limited transparency, right? Are they really getting all of the information, right? And there's so many tools online now that can help people get more clear view of pricing and price transparency. When you're physically in store, you're potentially impeded as a consumer from that price transparency experience. So too with the trade-in. Great to work like many of our retailers do in that sense of providing a lot of backup and a lot of supporting information when a trade-in value is provided for that vehicle. And then lastly, that lack of digital flexibility, right? How much fun is it to go in on the physical, or on the website, on that digital environment, and push all the buttons and make all your choices and build that vehicle and have that delivered the way you want, right? In many cases, when you're going in to the retail location, you're choosing what's available there. You don't really have that customization, that ability to get through that piece of the puzzle, right? That tech-savvy younger buyer that prefers that real digital first experience, they're not necessarily going to love that version of the in-person physical form. All right, so then we can take a step further into that online experience. And we'll just talk about this as being option 2. We'll call it approximately 50% of the online experience. So there's a lot more that you can do today, and many environments are already set up. Many websites that we support and that we're working with are already set up for that kind of 50-50 experience, right? So it starts with that online research phase and shortlisting the retailers that you want to visit, right? So as we go through this process, it could be relative to buyers using dealership OEM websites, or using the dealer site or using the manufacturer site, browsing inventory, comparing trims, getting a real deep understanding of the build of each vehicle and the pricing that they're getting. And when you consider some of the trucks out there today and all of the variations that you get, folks are spending a whole heck of a lot of time online to figure out those details. You're going to want to read reviews, get a good sense of what you're seeing relative to promotions, all those things. That's all that pre-list. And that's probably happening pretty commonly, right, in that 90% as well. That's the first 10. Well, we can go a little bit further into it, right? If we've got the ability to help consumers with that digital engagement, with that first encounter, sending in that inquiry. Maybe it's putting a chat on the online chat feature. Maybe it's sending in a lead. Maybe it's calling and having a conversation with a sales rep, or just simply booking a test drive online, right? Pre-qualifying even for financing is another option. And that's one that is of great interest to many of our retail partners, where they want to go through that process and punch in the details and get that detail figured out relative to booking the timing and simply confirming that they can afford this vehicle. They can get their financing pre-qualified. The in-person visit typically is going to happen next, and that's that consumer that has gone through all these processes, gone through all these steps, but they want to physically drive the car, right? All well and good. And it's interesting, chatting with folks along the way. Some retailers really want to make sure to get that consumer behind the wheel. The reality today, and I'm a sample set of one, but a good example of someone who drives a lot of rental vehicles and a lot of other vehicles out there, I've got a really good sense of what I like to drive. Do I need to go and test drive the new version of the vehicle that I'm getting? Or do I need to test drive a vehicle that I've driven in other locations or even in other cities? No, I know what it's going to drive like. I can make that decision without the in-person. But many folks have that keen interest in having that experience, that face-to-face time where they feel they can be more efficient, they can get a whole bunch of the decisions made based on the prep that they've done in advance. Then we've got the deal building, right? Going through that process of putting the deal together. And there's actually a lot more capabilities these days relative to hybrid deal making and going through that process, partially online, partially in person. So continuing that deal online, going through that process, maybe there's an email that comes through, or there could be a portal or an application that they're going to work through to complete more of that information, maybe more of the trade information, maybe more of the documentation review relative to license and going down the path of registration. Finally, negotiating might happen in person or online, right? So you're going to have that communication back and forth with the retail location. And like I was saying, some people like to have that negotiation in person. Many folks really appreciate being able to sit behind a keyboard and just poke the next price that they're willing to consider, right? That anonymity makes things a little bit easier sometimes. The next two are finance and paperwork, right? Being able to go through that process a little bit online or a little bit in person, right? Being able to get everything prepped to be able to just go in and sign off is a nice piece of the puzzle. In certain cases, you've got folks that are going to have all of the construction of the paperwork happen in person. Some organization or some regions still require a wet signature versus a digital signature. We saw through COVID a lot of changes to that, where people were allowing more and more, and financial institutions allowing more and more digital signature. The F&I products as well is a neat piece of the puzzle, and there's actually some cool studies that have been done to figure out that when a consumer is reading and self-selecting the products that they want to add to their vehicle purchase, be it a warranty, be it tire care, be it long-term service care, they are actually, in many cases, more likely to read through that information and self-select than they are to accept when being sold, if that makes sense, right? So a consumer that's making their own choices feels empowered, and someone who's being sold in the F&I office may feel like they're at a disadvantage and just have that knee-jerk reaction of just saying, no, thank you, right? So some benefits that come there. The last one is that relative difference when we're talking about delivery, right? Going in and picking up that freshly washed car from the store, or having a truck back up in front of your driveway and unload that vehicle into your driveway. That's a pretty cool experience, right? Another way that you can benefit from that with that 50-50 experience. So lots of options there. Let's get into the pros and cons. All right, so let's get into those pros and cons. On the dealer side, when we're talking about that transaction happening more online, right? Happening to that 50% point of the transaction occurring in a digital format, right? We're talking about getting, first off, qualified leads. And that's probably one of the nicest pieces of the puzzle, right? Being able to get that lead submission that has more of the affirmation that that consumer can actually buy the car, that they actually have real intent, they're going down the process of being pre-approved, that kind of stuff. So that's a real valuable piece of the puzzle. The next is efficiency. I just think of the benefit of being able to have all of these conversations simultaneously through a digital format. So it also shortens that in-person experience. It shortens the visit at the store and gets consumers to closure in that process a little bit more quickly. Real benefit there. The process is also scalable, right? So the online engagement and being able to reduce that digital paperwork or reduce that paperwork in total, and reduce the bottleneck of each team member. When you're thinking of someone coming in on a Saturday and going through that process and being able to work with a team member and get into the F&I office and go through all those things, if you can start to enable people to do some of those things while they're chilling on the couch and working on their mobile device or working on their laptop, that's going to make things a little bit easier for sure. There's actual real benefits in the CSI score of things, the customer satisfaction, right? So being able to actually give people more convenience, and that is really, the nature of it is today's transaction, today's currency is time, right? People typically, although that may be changing lately with interest rates and all that kind of fun stuff, but people typically have the funds that they need. They don't have the time that they need. So if you can provide them more value and a better experience, it's going to lead to a higher customer satisfaction index. The last piece of that puzzle is the opportunity, that F&I opportunities that are still really intact in the process. You still have the chance to present those offerings, and you may well have given the consumer some additional information before they got in. So they may have that benefit of being able to go through online tools, be able to see the things that they're going to be presented at a later date, as opposed to, you finish the sales meeting with the salesperson and surprise, you go in the F&I office and you're with another salesperson, right? Being able to give that consumer a little more information before they get in there to see the products that they're going to be looking at, they can make a more educated decision and feel less, dare I say, ambushed by that process, right? All right, that's the pro side. There's got to be some cons in the mix, to keep it balanced, right? So there's a level of digital readiness that is required at your retail location to be able to move more and more into this realm of e-commerce with our retailers. And I know a lot of folks still like to call it digital retailing. I struggle with it, but that's just me. So on the digital readiness, being able to invest time and effort as well as dollars into setting up the capabilities to be able to handle more of the transaction online. Super important piece of the puzzle. Bit of a downside, time, money. The staff flexibility is another one that is really important to consider. We struggle in our industry to get the right people working in store at the best of times. Let alone ensuring that they have all of the capabilities that we need them to have. That in-person interaction, that ability to communicate in person and go through that process isn't necessarily with a consumer or with a team member rather who also has the ability to handle all of the digital transactions, all of the email communications, or all of those pieces of the puzzle that are going to be important when you're having more digital transactions. So finding those right people. There is a risk, and this is one of the things that's been frustrating for folks along the way, is they start the process, and this is consumer side, you start the process online, and then you expect that the deal jacket is going to be ready to go when you get to the retail location. You expect that what you did originally is somehow communicated or transmitted into the dealership where you're then going to be able to pick up where you left off. And that's the idea of that omni-channel experience. One experience from digital to physical, back to digital, whatever the case. Everything it just moves seamlessly, like watching a Netflix show on your tablet, on your mobile, then on your TV, and then back to your tablet. It just doesn't happen as seamlessly that way most of the time. And that can be a real frustration for consumers. The last on the con list in this case is that there's often more of a complex follow-up required. So staying on top of the CRM, synchronizing the CRM with what's happening digitally and what's happening physically, right? Do we get the signals from what's happened on the website going into the CRM? Do we know about that walk-in as actually being the same person? Are we able to merge those details of those physical and digital interactions? So the buyer, of course, is going to benefit from some of these things as well. There's pros and cons for the buyer. In that sort of 50-50 realm, we think of it as being the best of both worlds, right? We get the reach, we get the research, we get the ability for that consumer to go through that process, to compare, to pre-qualify what it is that they want to purchase, to be able to get pre-qualified online, and then come in and have that physical touch, confirm everything in person, know that they've got that trust factor when they're coming in and finishing up in person, or doing whatever part of the process that they want to do in person, right? Real benefit. There's some time savings there, of course, when you're handling a lot of it online, and that's one of the things that's been really propagated through many retail locations throughout Canada and the US, is being able to reduce the amount of time that this transaction takes place. So being able to go through a bunch of the details and maybe arrive, and the deal jacket really is ready to go. And you just need to go on a tour of the car and sign off and handle a few details like getting your new license plates and insurance going, right? Important piece. Comfortable pace, right? So being able to actually move at the pace that the consumer feels comfortable with, right? There can be these challenges along the way where you're thinking, okay, well, I've got the vehicle, and now I want to sort out the details relative to financing and all that kind of stuff. Those details can be tricky, and it can be trickier when you've got pressure, when you're in the box, when you're working through the deal and someone's trying to help you and make those decisions. You may just want to take a step back. And if you're sitting on the couch, it's pretty easy to take a step back. You can even go get a snack. The transparent process is a real nice piece of the puzzle, right? Being able to have more access to that information at the start, during whatever point of the process when you're going back and forth working through those details. Real benefit to the consumer. And then the flexibility. So being able to choose how much you're going to do online versus in store. I'm still a fuddy-duddy, right? I haven't said fuddy-duddy in a long, long time. That's kind of fun. But I'm still one of those people who doesn't necessarily want to put certain information into a system online, right? So when we're talking about qualifying for a loan, right, social insurance number and that kind of stuff, like there's limits, right? So people need to have the flexibility to put in what they're comfortable with versus what they're uncomfortable with. So that kind of half and half environment enables people to make the choices that they want to make. So on the downside for the consumer, there's a few pieces to consider, right? So not everyone is as savvy. I spent some time helping my mom out, working through the technical things that happen in her life, right? With her laptop, with her tablet, whatever the case. Many, many consumers out there are still struggling with some of the things that other consumers would find natural, right? So the technical literacy that is required from the consumer to be successful in a hybrid process or a heavily digital process is really quite high. And that's going to keep people away from transacting that way, probably for quite some time, right? The next is potential for miscommunication. When we're interacting with consumers in person and they're in the store for the duration of the experience, there's less likelihood that they're going to have trouble relative to the communication, what's being said at the start of that experience right through to the end. Whereas when information is in multiple places, right, it might be on the website, maybe they saw it on a third-party listing, they came to your store, they're looking at the vehicle there, they go through and they make some pricing decisions, they make some financing decisions, then they come to the location and maybe there's something that's happened. Maybe there's a special finance rate, or maybe there's a special offer, or maybe the price has gone up, like the financing program from the manufacturer stopped, right? All those things can create this mismatch of the expectations. That next piece is that fragmented experience. And this, in my view, can happen both in physical and online. But if you're going through a process with a consumer and you're interacting online and you're asking lots of questions, you may get moved and passed around from knowledge base to knowledge base, right? So consider it from the salesperson who's working on getting you the right unit to the F&I person who's helping you with something else, right? That fragmented experience is a pretty common thing. And in fact, many retailers are now making a shift to go through that process where you're with one person from beginning to end, kind of that person that's the concierge of your experience through that buying process. The last piece is relative to visibility of what is actually available online, right? Or what's available in store, and having that, be a real-time simile between those two pieces, right? So if we run into those difficulties, we could be, really excited about a unit that's there online, it's showing is available, and then we try to finish things up in store and it's been sold, right? So different tools within our web platform, there's ability to show deal pending and that kind of stuff when deals are being worked on in store that helps with that. But there is that potential for disappointment to really come through at the end of the day when that vehicle or that unit isn't delivering as expected, or just the experience isn't delivering as expected. So definitely the hybrid model is becoming more and more prevalent in the Canadian market, in the US as well, and really across the board. And it's a function of finding the best ways that we can help consumers make decisions and help them towards the buying process, be it online, in person, in the way that they want to transact. So there's certain limitations to going too far down the path, and we can talk about that a little bit more in just a sec. All right, so the last of the, and really still hybrid, there's still some physical aspects, but let's think about a transaction that happens really up to about 90% digitally. And there's lots and lots of efforts being made in the market today to enable this kind of thing. As we mentioned at the onset, Carvana, Clutch in Canada, Amazon transactions happening with Hyundai, the Genesis model, again with the Hyundai Motor Company, right? There's lots of different ways that one can satisfy the goals of the consumer who's ready to transact in that way. And that's really kind of the interesting piece of it. The more tools we have in place, the more people we're going to satisfy. But that fraction of the market who's willing to do so much online is exactly that, a fraction of the market today. I've said it a few times in many different conversations and contexts. Most consumers are not in that kind of 1% situation where they can afford to and feel comfortable with a major financial transaction happening digitally. And that's really what we're fighting against. That, and frankly, people being comfortable and confident in the transaction of that size happening digitally with a retail automotive location, right? There's still, unfortunately, trust factors that get in the way of that happening. But let's dig into it a little bit. So we're talking about everything from digital discovery and selection, which we've talked about a few times, we're talking about going through the trade-in process, right? Being able to do that online. And there's lots of environments where you can get a guaranteed trade appraisal online, be it a good value for the retailer or not. That's another story, but it's feasible. Going through the financing options online and going through those details, totally doable, right? Then deal building and going through creating your deal, selecting your financing options, or coming with financing options and going through that kind of the process, and being able to go through and sign off digitally, right? Certainly feasible within today's online environment. And really, when you put all those pieces together, that's really the 90% of the deal, right? The next is saying, hey, when are you going to come by and get your vehicle? Or maybe there's a physical delivery that's happening at your location and you're signing off on the paperwork there if you haven't already digitally signed. So there's lots of ways to make these things happen. It's not for lack of technology today, that's absolutely clear. It's really a function of the consumer's comfort in transacting at such a high rate, right? A vehicle, we're talking $50,000 to $100,000, whatever or more, right? Vehicles are expensive. Financing vehicles is more complex than the typical consumer is willing to do online. So we've got to help them out in a variety of different ways. But let's have a quick peek at the pros and cons of going, I'm going to say it, the full Monty. All right. Again, we'll keep this one tight too, because this is one of those things where we're covering a few areas that we've already seen before in partial, and now this is really where you're doing most of these things online. So the pros for the dealer of getting even more involved online: operational efficiency, right up there at the top. We've talked about that. Expanded reach, being able to actually sell vehicles to people far beyond your DMA, right? Not a bad thing, unless, of course, your manufacturer frowns against it. Customer data capture, being able to get all of that information about the consumer and hold on to that to build your database, to build your CRM, and potentially to track that lifetime value of the customer through a customer data platform, whatever the case. So being able to keep track of that customer data to a greater degree over time. Being able to sell that vehicle 24/7, right? Being able to enable your retail location to never sleep, right? Pretty cool little benefit. And then there's that last piece, is that greater appeal to the consumers that really want to transact that way. The digital natives, those Gen Zs or Gen youngins that are coming in and they're totally digitally savvy, they're digital natives, they understand all the ins and outs, and they couldn't think of anything more preposterous than buying something in person, right? They're going to go online, clickety-click, and make it happen. All right, so the cons on the dealer side, right? There's a few of those as well. We've got higher tech investment right up front. It's going to cost a little more to get yourself set up to be able to handle these transactions online. And often the question mark is, well, why would I do that for so few transactions that are happening online? And really it's that ability to capture the transactions that are or that have the potential to happen. But like I said, when we're talking about hybrid, that 50-50 or even 90-10 on the physical side, is it necessary at this point in time? Not quite, right? But that technical investment is important up front. There is that potential of reduced F&I sales opportunities, right? Like I said about the research that shows that sometimes that decision making that's happening separately from that in person can actually be of benefit. I think a bit of a blend of the two, informing the consumer up front and then helping them make those decisions in person, is probably the best there. So there may be some losses there. The risk of not having that rapport and loyalty, and it's a fascinating thing. Loyalty among brands is one of the things that has changed the most in the last 15, 20 years for consumers. We are less loyal in the brands that we stick with, right? Back in the day, be stereotypical, your dad was an Oldsmobile driver, you'd drive an Oldsmobile too, right? It was just what we knew and what we did. Today, all the different options, all the different possibilities, the loyalty has far gone. So any opportunity that you have to interact with a customer, to have them be loyal to a human, to an individual that they love at your retail location, be it yourself or someone else on your team, that's a real benefit. The next and probably the last of the cons for the dealer side of things in this respect is the complexity of the logistics involved in getting it done. right? From beginning to end, there can be all these little tidbits that are supposed to connect perfectly, and invariably tech has this funny thing when it's a physical thing and a technology thing, working it all together and making it come out just right can be tough. And that's why so many of these digital retail organizations that have been putting add-ons to websites and trying to make them work in the US market, and the Canadian market, and all that sort of stuff have really fallen flat and been unsuccessful. So it's a matter of finding those key pieces that are important to you and your business and the way that your consumers are transacting in your market, and making the decisions to add those pieces to your web experience, to your digital sales experience, and helping them the way that they want to be helped. All right, so now from the buyer side, when we're talking about being able to do so much online, what's not good about that? How many of us pull out our device when we're thinking, oh, I need X, and you hit the Amazon button, and all of a sudden it's showing up your door maybe the same day, maybe 24 hours later. We love that ultimate convenience. And the ideal of this scenario is that everything runs smoothly and we can get the finance at the rate we want, and we can, everything is going to work and everything is going to be smooth. So that function for the consumer is why people say, yes, I would buy my car online, absolutely. But when you get right down to it, it can be tricky. It can be downright tricky. So they love the convenience, they love the control, they love the faster process, they love access to all these options to be able to make the choices and choose the experience that they want. And oftentimes they perceive a better price experience as a result, right? So those are all the pro side of things that can be pretty exciting. The con side of things relative to that buyer, right, that's a little bit different. As soon as you run into trouble, there isn't that hands-on experience to be able to help you. As soon as you want to test drive that car, you may not be able to jump in the seat of that car. Maybe you got to trust an online version of the test drive, right? There's the trust issues that invariably are going to come into play as you're working through this process. If something is not absolutely correct, trust is going to erode quickly, right? And that's an important piece to consider. On the human support side of things, right, again, as soon as something goes sideways, that ability to get that guidance, to get that knowledgeable help from someone is what's going to be absent. Invariably, when we're helping someone through such a big transaction, right, second biggest transaction in their lives typically, right, it's a really big deal. The next is that technical literacy barrier. If they're not super capable in this environment, or they're not feeling comfortable in this environment, right, the lion's share of consumers transacting today that are in the 50 plus category probably aren't going to be as tech savvy in that environment. It's a gross generalization I can appreciate, but it's just the nature of things. The last being delivery delays or issues, right? When you're going through that process and you've made that selection, imagine going through the whole thing thinking you're going to get that vehicle right away, and then, oh, lo and behold, it was actually sold to someone else physically, and now we've got to wait for the next unit to come in, all that kind of stuff. Everybody who tried to buy a car through COVID had that maximum experience of that transaction and having to wait for supply, right? So any of those delivery issues can really cause a problem for the consumer side. So there you have it. Nothing but options. Pretty straightforward, right? No. And so we got to think, right, which one is actually going to be best for you and your retail location? And there's a lot of variables at play here, and there's no doubt that, like, for the 90% offline environment, that's the tried and true. Many of us have been doing that for years and years. Works smoothly. Low digital adoption. You don't have to worry too much about getting more people more technically savvy. Maybe great for your market if you're in a more a more rural market, that sort of thing, where you're not worried too much about getting the tech savvy folks. Higher pre-sale control, so you've got the ability to work people through the process and help them know what's going on. The downside, you may miss out on those younger consumers that just want to do a little bit more online, right? Go far the other way to that 90% online piece, and you may have some issues. You might get maximum convenience, but they might not be able to actually get through the whole process. Things may fall down, or they may not have the experience that they're expecting, or they can't quite figure out the finance details, or they can't figure out how to sort out the pricing for their vehicle. Maybe they're not excited about the trade-in value that they're getting. All of those sorts of things can be tricky, right? So we're finding more and more that the market is shifting towards that 50-50, right? Helping people do a lot of the pieces that they can do online, getting a little more information, pre-qualifying themselves, maybe getting a few details relative to their trade-in, getting an understanding what that's going to look like, right? Maybe being able to speak with someone, come in, do a little bit of the work in that physical space, and then maybe go home with some of the F&I details and make a decision, right? All those pieces enable a consumer to just frankly feel that comfort of both sides, where the digital is beneficial and where the physical is beneficial. And it really just seems more and more that that's where folks are landing these days. For us, at the end of the day, we want to enable our retailers to make all of the decisions that they can, both digitally and physically, and have the tools available for them to do it. Like I said, we're seeing more and more folks go that 50-50 or hybrid model. I'd be very curious, and if you want to put a little comment below and share some details, what is it that you're doing? What is it that you're doing at your retail location? What have you found to be the most valuable way to communicate the benefits of consumers working with you digitally and coming into store? And at what point do you find that changeover where they're working the deal partly online and then finally they decide, you know what, I'm going to come into that physical location? How do you do that? And what gets better when they come in that door? In any case, thanks so much for joining me at my desk. Again, my name's Cruickshank. I look forward to spending more time with you in the future.